Okay, Chair Williams.
Join all
Here.
your comments, and then there's a big thing for
Vice Chair Portillo Morales.
Click that one, so it'll say
Here.
HTTP, CPS Energy,
Mr. Alvaro Rodriguez.
It is.
I saw him.
I'm here.
Okay,
I'm here.
excellent. Yeah. Anita Ledbetter.
Yes, click on that. It'll get you into the meeting.
Okay, Anthony Edwards. Got to check. I think Ann saw you log in. Yep, there you are, Anthony. Andy Castillo.
Here.
I don't know why it's not matching.
Anne Marie Nikolic.
Present.
And you're on your normal email.
Curtis Anastasio.
Here.
Let me have Adrian, the guy
Dana McGinnis.
before you send you a new link real quick and see if maybe that'll help. So you're welcome. Thank you.
Dana, are you present? Doesn't look like it. Okay, we'll skip that. Dee Belmares.
I'm here.
Excellent. Jack Hebden.
Here.
Jim Berg. Yep, looks like you're present. John Agather. Also
Here.
looks like you're logged on. Thank you very much. Michael Kennick.
I'm here.
Like you're logged on. Okay, very good. Michael Sanchez.
I'm here.
Excellent. Norman Dugas. Not sure I see Norman. Norman, are you with us?
Norman will not be at our meeting tonight. He's going to watch it later.
Okay. Thanks, Ann. Dr. Femi, I believe we saw you logged in.
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, very good. Peter Onofre.
Here.
Excellent. Seymour Battle. Okay. And then last, Wayne Eddington.
Here.
Okay, thank you. What's the count?
A lot. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16.
Okay, we clearly have a quorum. Okay, just a couple of points tonight. We're going to try something a little different. Again, as we go through these virtual meetings, there's always hopefully some things we can improve. We're going to have the presenter go through to a certain point, and then he'll come to a slide that says questions and discussions. We'll stop there. So if everyone during they're coming, just be patient. So if you could just hold your questions, we think we've split it up so that it's logical points to stop for questions. We would like for you to enter your questions into the chat. We will have Ann accumulating the questions. Those questions will then be asked to the Brattle group, and they'll answer them. We'll go through, we can. If we've got real long and involved questions, we'll table them. They'll get answered later. We do not have any folks to speak tonight, so we have plenty of time, and we hope we'll be able to take everyone's questions. And at that point, Chad, I'll just turn it right back over to you.
And this is Wayne Eddington. I'd like to say something before we get started to the group, please. I appreciate what you said. I've been listening to these meetings, and I assume that you all are trying to get us through these briefings so that we could get to the point to actually do some work and identify the problem. A lot of questions I'm hearing is tasking CPS to do stuff outside of CPS. What are they doing in California? What are they doing in El Paso? We talk about carbon footprint. We talk about all these things. We haven't got to identify the problem yet. So I would think as a group, we need to get through the training since CPS think it's pertinent for us to do it. And then once we get to problem solving, we can bring up low income. We can bring up all those things. But right now, we don't even know what the problem is. So I appreciate what you're saying.
Well, we're going to continue with these educational sessions, and then clearly we'll get into the problems, Wayne. I don't think there'll be a question on that. Okay, go ahead, Jeff.
All right, thank you, Reed. Adrian, will you share the CPS branded deck?
Yes, sir, will do.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome back. Happy to be here again this evening. So I'm going to have just a few sort of procedural administrative comments, just like I did last time, and then I'll turn it over to Dr. Faruqi. Adrian, if you'll jump to slide 3, the first thing I want to do is sort of recenter and reground everybody on our roadmap of content. So green checks next to the stuff that we've already covered. Of course, last meeting, 2 weeks ago, we spent about an hour and a half or more talking about the objectives of rate design. It was a really good conversation. For tonight, we take that sort of to the next logical step is what are the rate designs that help achieve those objectives, and what are the trends in the industry, and are there case studies that we can look at that represent those trends? So we've got about an hour and a half of content. As Reed said, we've got just about every 2 or 3 slides, we have a stop sign built into the deck. So you can ask questions. Certainly you can ask questions. Then following this, so 2 weeks from tonight, we'll do the cost of service. And then we did make a change to the roadmap. We moved the red and the purple. We swapped the red and the purple. So from the questions that I was getting, I was sensing that we really need to kind of connect the academic rate design stuff we're talking about with our rates, with CPS Energy's rates, and what we think of those rates and where we think we're going with those rates, because those are the questions that I'm getting. And so that's kind of the next logical conversation to have. We're targeting August for that. Then we'll talk about the social issues and then the generation strategy. So that's where we are and where we're going. Adrian, if you flip to the next slide. As we talk about questions, we mentioned last week that we are working on a place on the website for those questions. And our marketing team and Ann have worked real hard to get this section updated. We've made it easier to find the live stream information. So this is cpsenergy.com/RAC, R-A-C. Right on the front page, you see the first orange bubble, which is the meeting live stream. And then it's super easy to find the agendas and presentations. And then we've added the question and answer section. And here's how that works. Adrian, go to the next slide. You click that orange button, and I know it's small, but I do encourage you to go out and see this because we're real pleased with how it looks. It has not been a small effort to get it up and running. So you'll see the 5 categories of content on the left. And then you click one of the categories, there's a link under each one for the questions that apply to that category. You click that link, it takes you to another page that lists the questions that we've received in any form, email, in person, live, on these virtual meetings. And it lists all of those questions. And then each question that we have already been able to provide an answer to, we've hyperlinked it so you can click on that and see the answer that we've put together. Right now, we only have about 3 out there, but we got another half a dozen to a dozen that are coming in the next couple of days. Like I said, we've been focused on just getting this functionality up, but we are turning our focus now to the questions. So we're going to try to do a better job of managing those questions tonight. As Reed said, type them into the chat, and we will get them forward and get them answered, or we'll put them off to later if they're too lengthy of a conversation, just depending on time. And that's it. Those are the administrative comments I had. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Faruqi again. And like I said, I'm real excited about tonight. It's some real clear, interesting information around rate design trends.
Excuse me, I don't know if we can ask questions without typing the questions into some box. But
No.
There's no opportunity for that at all.
No.
Okay.
No, let's type them in. That way we get through the presentation. They'll bring all those back up.
Right. I mean, I understand the need to move this quickly, but let's see how it works. I guess we're still in an experimental phase, but I'm suspecting that some questions might be too long to type. But let's go ahead and see how it works.
Thank you.
Okay, Dr. Faruqi?
Thank
We
you very
cannot
much.
hear you. There you go.
If this first slide could be put up there by Adrian, I think I'll get started. Thank you very much. So good evening. I hope everyone's doing well. This is a continuation of the discussions we had 2 weeks ago. As was indicated by Chad, we're going to do a deeper dive into some of the rate design trends. And then towards the end, we will touch upon some case studies. And as the chair indicated, we have several slides throughout this deck that will read questions and discussion, and that will be the opportunity for us to have a conversation. I think the chair has encouraged you to type in your questions via chat, and during those breaks, we will read those questions and respond to them. Think of this as certainly your meeting. It's not my meeting, it's your meeting. It's your chance to question or comment on what I'm presenting. I'll share with you some of our experience working on rate design issues in the US and in Canada and also abroad. There is a lot of material on the subject, and I have included some references at the end of the deck to other work that we have done in terms of articles and papers. You will have the deck. If you would like to read any of those papers or chapters, we'll make an arrangement to get them sent to you. My colleagues in this effort, Augie Rose and Sanem Surgiji, are not available this evening. One is on vacation, and the other one is several time zones away visiting her parents. So it'll just be me tonight, working with the CPS team to handle the questions and to take your comments. So with that, let's go to the next slide, please. Thank you. The next slide, as you will see, summarizes the principles that we had discussed during the last conversation. And I am just bringing them up to sort of refresh our memory on where did we end the last conversation. So just for reference, let me read through the list, and then I would welcome your comments and reactions to these principles to see if you think any principle is missing. You should let us know what that principle is. If you think some principle is ambiguous and unclear, you can certainly ask that question of me and I will explain. And if you think that there is one particular principle among these that's really important and you want to let us know what that particular principle is, this would be your opportunity to do that as well. So first, I'm just going to repeat the principles and then we will have a bit of discussion on the principles. And again, this is a recap of what we did the last time, so it's just to get started. The first principle is economic efficiency, which basically means that rates should reflect the cost of service. That's basically what it means. If you price electricity correctly, so it reflects the true cost of service, people will consume the right amount of electricity. If you price it too low, they will overconsume it. If you price it too high, they will underconsume it. So economic efficiency is achieved not just for electricity, but for every industry and service in the US by pricing based on cost. So that's the first principle. The second principle is that when you have different customer classes, like residential, commercial, and industrial, for example, and in some cases agricultural is a class as well, then you should make sure that each customer class is paying its fair share of the total cost. So ideally, if you have 5 classes, hypothetically speaking, and each class has 20% of the total cost, then each class should be paying 20% of the revenue to you. So revenues and costs should be aligned by class. Otherwise, you will have inequities between classes. Third is the principle of revenue stability. The utility industry, as we know, is very capital intensive, a lot of generation plant, a lot of transmission, a lot of distribution. Those costs have to be recovered for the utility to stay in business, and therefore revenue stability is an important attribute of rate design. You can't have revenue fluctuating plus or minus 100% across 5 years because no utility can stay in business with that kind of fluctuation. So rate design should promote revenue stability. Fourth is bill stability. And this is the flip side of that. This is the same issue for customers. Customers should have some idea of bill stability. They don't want to have bills fluctuating like crazy because that creates cash flow issues for them. And this is true month to month, but it is also true from year to year. Again, these are goals or principles. They cannot all be satisfied simultaneously, and no principle can be satisfied 100%. That's just the nature of rate design. So we have to make judgments, hopefully intelligent judgments, that allow us to make the right trade-offs between these principles. The next principle is customer satisfaction. Now, this is often raised as a concern because the idea is that the customers have no choice. They have just one electric utility, and it's like a monopoly situation. So customers sometimes get frustrated. They don't have a choice. But even though they don't have a choice, they still want to be happy with the rates they're paying. They want to understand, why am I paying this rate? Why is my bill too high, for example? Why is it fluctuating? So utilities have to strive to reach out to customers, to engage with them, and to answer their questions, and to address their concerns. That's what's meant here by customer satisfaction. And then comes the issue of affordability. That has become an extremely important issue in the US, particularly since the pandemic, but it has been there for a while. There are customers who are not able to put food on the table. They're not able to address their health care or child care needs. And then comes the issue of energy and electricity and gas and so on. And so those expenditures on energy have to be managed in such a way by the utility and also by the customer that they don't eat up more than 6% of their budget. And that's kind of like a guideline that has been used a lot by other utilities, and it comes from the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy, the 6% target. It cannot always be met, but at least that's the goal that has been laid out by many policymakers and utilities. And finally, there is the issue of decarbonization. I think we are all aware of the movement in the last decade or so towards managing climate change, towards reducing emissions of carbon from burning fossil fuels. And so there is a worldwide and certainly a nationwide movement to promote decarbonization by getting customers to buy efficient equipment, by also having the utility have a generation mix that is producing less emissions than it used to. And then, of course, there's the question of how can we do that and still have affordability? So that there's a tussle there between these objectives. So those are the 7 objectives or principles of rate design that we discussed the last time. And let's go to the next slide. So I'm going to pause here and take the questions that have been posed. So I'm now looking at the chat box.
I think we've answered all of the questions that have been put through the chat box. Me and Chad are playing tag team and answering them. So I think right now we're good. So we'll see just if anybody else has a question they'd like to ask.
Great. So feel free to ask a question verbally here, and I'd be happy to answer it. Just focus on the principles. Okay, it looks like one question just popped up about decarbonization. Should I address it?
Yes, please.
Okay, so looks like there were 2 questions.
Yes, sir. They're both on decarbonization.
Yes, so the first question from Al is on decarbonization. Is this mostly political? Some people view it as political, and certainly in the United States, there is some division between those who accept the concept and those who don't. I'm going to stay away from that aspect. I'm just going to simply say that it is a reality in the political space to accept it, and utilities have accepted it as a goal, as an objective. Now, obviously, it is potentially not going to satisfy everyone to have it being addressed, but it is an objective that is hard to ignore. In every rate design proceedings I've taken part in the United States, and I have been part of many, many proceedings and also webinars. This is an issue that is here to stay. And so I'm just going to say that's pretty much my answer to that question. Then there is and then maybe let me pause. Anne, do you have anything further to add on that, or Chad?
The only thing I would add is that, yes, this is a very political topic. However, we're a business that serves our community and serves our customers. And so we always want to be listening to our customers. And there are customers that prioritize decarbonization. And that is a focus of theirs. And so to that extent, we are listening, and we're trying to design our product accordingly.
Thank you. Okay, so then.
Well, there is another question here that was on the chat, and it's a request to see some published data on that. Not asking you to take an opinion one way or the other, but published data on how that affects whatever various utilities do, how that affects rates, and how that either mitigates or reduces emissions. And I think that's a fair question. And I mean, you should, as one of the people that are supposedly giving us advice, you should provide that for us.
Yes, yeah, I will. And let me that was the second question, I believe, from Michael Sanchez, right? So let me address that question, and then I'll get you the data, the publications after the meeting, working with the CPS team. So I guess the question is, should we be concerned that we will saturate the planet with carbon, or if we have more carbon, we'll have increased tree and plant growth? Okay, so that's a question that's really broad and goes beyond rate design. All I will say to you is many utilities and commissions and boards, including the state governments, have a goal, which is to promote less use of technologies that release carbon in the air, such as gasoline-powered cars, such as gas furnaces. Okay? And once you have those objectives, then there is an implication for rate design. And the implication for rate design is, how do we promote electrification of end uses? How do we get people to buy electric cars and to install electric heat pumps, for example? If that principle is of importance to you, as the RAC and as CPS, then you will begin to pay attention to the impact that rates have on either encouraging or discouraging electrification. And that's what the implication would be of that principle. Now, I believe there was a request, where is the published science we can examine? So I'll work with CPS and provide you some articles that talk about the need to decarbonize the planet, and some articles that talk about what electric rate design can do to promote electrification. And then there's another question by Edwards. How do you determine the 6% variable impacts indigent, elderly, and or working poor? The 6% number is not a number I came up with. It is a number that's widely accepted among policymakers in the US as a target, that if you go above 6%, you are really creating issues for people. Like if it's 10% or 15% or 20%, which, by the way, it is for many people who are in this category of being the working poor, for example, people with medical disabilities, senior citizens. So that is why it is a principle of rate design, affordability, to try to make sure it doesn't go above 6%. And rate design alone cannot solve the issue. You have to also have energy efficiency, as we discussed the last time. You also may have simply the tax code. You can use the tax code to provide subsidies to people who are in that lower income category. Okay? So there are multiple levers that are needed to address the issue of affordability. Okay, so then there is a question, CPS, I guess it's a statement. CPS has committed to decarbonization through the CAAP, and CPS has a 2030 goal in carbon reduction. What weight does the cap have on rates? So perhaps somebody from CPS can address that question.
You know, let's table that one and we'll get you a better answer. But, you know, I guess my preliminary answer, what I would say is we have targets through the cap and we've committed to achieve those. When we set our rates, we recover our costs. So, you know, the cost associated with achieving the cap comes through our rates. And we can sort of quantify that for you later.
Got you. And just for reference, CAP stands for Climate Action and Adaptation Plan. It was adopted by the City Council. So we'll follow up on that with you. All right, thank you. It looks like that's it on the principles. Let's move on to the next.
May I ask a question, Reed? It's Kurt.
Sure, go ahead.
Sorry, I typed it in, but it was either skipped or not seen. But and I don't need the answer immediately, but what is the annual revenue number CPS says it needs, given our recent experience, to have a reliable power system, including the cost of CapEx to ensure adequate capacity? So I'm asking this without regard to the other factors on this list we have here with a, you know, decarb and affordability and all that. What is the revenue number they think we need to have a reliable system? That was my question.
Thank you.
Can I ask a clarifying question to that? Do you mean to say what percentage is a fixed cost of our expenses?
Sorry, are you asking me? It's Kurt here.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Kurt. I was just trying to clarify what you're asking. Are you asking?
If you need to, if you need to answer it by allocating it between fixed and variable, that's fine with me. I'm just asking, do you as an institution have a point of view, given our recent experience, as to what annual revenue you need to deliver a reliable power system? That's the question. I don't need the answer immediately, but yeah, putting it out there.
I think this is Reed, Kurt. I think we'll get into that is when Chad starts laying out his rate case in this next section. If I'm mistaken, Chad, correct me.
Well, we'll talk through our revenue requirements, you know, for the next several years. I guess I would say, Kurt, that's a very complex question, and there's shades of the right answer. You know, we are working through our processes to look at our budget and figure out what are the changes that need to be made to achieve the community's desired level of reliability.
Yeah, I appreciate that. That's a complex question for every business, right? So again, I'm not asking for an immediate answer, and so, you know, I'm trying not to get, you know, diverted into sort of terminology and what category of revenue goes in and all that. I'm just trying to say, what do you need? What income do you need?
But Kurt, I don't think they know that yet.
Okay, fair enough.
I would say I would doubt they know that right now because they've still got a lot of work to do. But if Ed knows that, then he's welcome. I mean, I'd love to hear it, but I think that's going to have to get developed in the next few months.
No, fair enough. That's fine. I thank you. I didn't mean to divert.
No, that's fine.
Yep.
All right, let's go on to the next section, Doctor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So we are now going into the rate design portion of the conversation. We're going to dig a little deeper into what goes into designing rates and why this is an opportune time to revisit the rates that exist. Most utilities are doing it, for all the same reasons that CPS is likely to be doing it in the near future. So this discussion will not get into CPS rate structures. We're going to save that for 2 sessions out. As was mentioned earlier, this session is on rate design. 2 weeks from now, we're going to be discussing cost of service. And then in August, as Chad indicated, we'll get into CPS specific rate designs and revenue requirements kinds of issues. So continuing with the conversation, what we have today, particularly for residential customers, this mismatch between how utilities recover revenue and how they incur their costs, the mismatch is brought out in this figure. So the figure has the major cost categories laid out as the first column. The first row is the variable cost, which is the dollars per kilowatt hour, and that's the fuel cost. And much of the fuel could be gas, so it could be nuclear, it could be coal, it could be hydro, it depends on which utility you're looking at. But that fuel cost varies with the amount of electricity being produced. That's a big chunk of variable cost. The other big chunk is operations and maintenance. And then comes the fixed cost, which is so much per customer, and that's your metering and billing cost and your overhead costs. And then finally, there is some cost related to what is called demand or capacity, which is measured as kW rather than kWh. So kWh is energy and kW is capacity or demand. And you have generation capacity, distribution capacity, and transmission capacity for the typical electric utility. So in this example, this is hypothetical, but the percentages are realistic for most utilities. Variable costs account for 60% of the cost, $60 of the cost of this utility. Fixed cost is $10, and the demand or capacity cost is $50. So this utility cost example has $120 of total cost, split 60, 10, and 50 on the cost side, but the rate design that led to this customer's bill is not reflective of this cost structure, because most of the costs that are not variable, like the demand cost and the fixed cost, all but $5 of those is included in the variable cost. So $115 out of the $120, let's say this is a monthly bill, are put in the variable charge, and the fixed cost is just a token amount. Now, this is an example just as a point of reference. Each utility is different. CPS's numbers will be different, but this does reflect the tension that is there in today's rate designs, which is most of the revenue is being recovered volumetrically or through variable costs. And as you engage in energy efficiency and conservation, which every utility is trying to do, you begin to lose revenue because your variable bill component goes down as kilowatt hour sales go down. And then the question is, how do I recover my fixed cost and my demand costs, which haven't changed with volume? And that's the tension that you will see being brought out in the new rate designs that I will talk about in the slides that follow. So next slide, please. So here is the current rate design structure. For mass market customers, which are residential and small commercial customers, there's a customer charge, typically a small number. In California, it's $0 for the investor-owned utilities, it's $20 for the municipal utility. Usually municipal utilities and cooperatives have a higher fixed charge than investor-owned utilities. But in most cases, they do not still recover the full fixed cost in the customer charge. Very few utilities are able to do it. And then there is the energy charge, which measures the flow of electricity, the volume, energy, if you will. In most cases, it is flat. It doesn't change with how much you use. It doesn't change with when you use it. In a few instances, it may vary by when you use it, and that's the varying by time of consumption. In some cases, it may vary based on the magnitude of the usage, the inclining block rate structure that we discussed the last time. A few utilities have that. However you look at it, the energy charge dominates the bulk of the bill for mass market consumers, and therefore is not cost reflective of getting the electricity to their building, to their house, or to their office. And then you have the large commercial and industrial customers. So they also have a bill that is similar to that of the mass market, except in one aspect, which is they also now have a demand charge. So they have a customer charge and an energy charge. Both are there for mass market as well as large C&I customers. But what's new and different for them is there is a demand charge to measure the capacity or the width of the pipe, so to speak, or the wire in the case of electricity. It's expressed in dollars per kW. And for a lot of utilities, that demand charge for these large customers could account for 25 to 30% of the total customer's bill, as opposed to 0%, which is what it is for the mass market consumers. So large C&I customers have a rate design that is more cost reflective than the rate design of mass market consumers. And that is why a lot of the changes that are taking place in rate design around the US are focused on changing the rate design for mass market customers. Next, please. Okay, so I'm going to stop here and see if there are any questions here. The discussion was about the split in costs between fixed, variable, and demand versus the composition of revenue, which is mostly volumetric and very little fixed. There is a tension, and that is the tension that we're going to be getting into as we look at the trends in the industry. So does anyone have any questions about this disconnect that I was talking about?
I might have a question, which might also be a disconnect here. So it doesn't seem to explain where a utility has more demand than they can meet and how that goes into the rate structure, other than just having a rolling blackouts. So should that be part of the the general discussion about how to set these rates, knowing that from time to time and maybe often you have a shortage of capacity to deliver what is demanded of the system?
That's a great question, and absolutely, yes, it is a rate design question without a doubt. And there are solutions being offered, and I will discuss those as we get into the industry trends conversation. I will also indicate here that pricing is one instrument that you can use to manage demand when demand exceeds supply, which it will during really heat waves or really cold waves. And of course, Texas has had both. California has its share of heat waves. And so you have another activity that is a complementary activity to rate design, and that's called demand response. And demand response basically includes programs like interruptible rates, or it could include programs like direct load control of air conditioners during heat waves. It also includes programs that send signals to smart thermostats to adjust them upwards by a degree or two when it looks like aggregate demand is going to exceed aggregate supply. And so I'll get more into it with some examples in the next several slides.
So is that something that has been tested in the courts? Is that even legal to have the central system control somebody's use and shut power off, as you're suggesting?
Okay, so by the way, I didn't say to shut power off. When you have a blackout, that's shutting power off. What I'm talking about is demand response programs and dynamic pricing programs to manage demand and supply with the customer's concurrence. The customer gets a reward during other months of the year in return for allowing the utility to adjust the thermostat. Oklahoma Gas and Electric has an incredible program along those lines. 1 out of 5 customers in Oklahoma are part of that program, where the utility sends a price signal to the thermostat that today is a more expensive day, and the customer has the option of saying, okay, I'll let the thermostat go up by 2 degrees or 4 degrees, or no, I'm going to not let it adjust at all. The customer is still controlling the thermostat, but the utility is sending a signal to the thermostat that today's an expensive day. You may want to raise your setting for a few hours just to prevent either the cost of power from really going through the roof or preventing a blackout. So these are cooperative programs. A blackout, by contrast, is not a cooperative program, as you know, and no customer likes to have a blackout. I'm one who has experienced blackouts, and I'm sure you have as well. Nobody has challenged blackouts as being unconstitutional, as far as I know. It's just the system is unable to meet the need. It's an unpleasant situation, and the solutions I'm talking about, demand response or dynamic pricing, they are less severe than a blackout. And that's why I think these are worthy of discussion. I mean, blackouts are unfortunately encountered when the system has not been planned well, and when enough customers are not engaged in demand response or dynamic pricing. That's when demand is uncontrolled, the system is unable to handle it, and then physically you shut the power off, which is without the customer's consent, right? Which is going to cause massive inconvenience. It should be a last resort. Okay, it looks like there is a, okay, so Chad, you have answered a question, it looks like, on fixed cost versus variable cost.
We had a couple of requests for the chart that you showed applied to our cost structure and our revenue. And so we absolutely will bring that chart forward here in a couple of weeks. But I wanted to go ahead and give you kind of directional numbers.
Got you. Okay. So costs are roughly 50% fixed, 50% variable. Revenue is roughly 10%. Sorry, I'm going to turn it off. Revenue is roughly 10% from fixed components of the bill and 90% of the variable charges. And that's very, very similar in general to what I've seen at most utilities. This is a challenge that most utilities have, and they're trying to deal with it by modifying their rate design. Okay, then there was another question about the impact of the 28% of past due customers and 18% of customers that are eligible for disconnect. So is this something, Anita, that we can save for the CPS session that will occur 2 meetings out? Okay, got you. So she gave us the green light.
Yeah.
Thank you. All right, let's continue.
I think that's it.
Okay, great. All right. So moving on to the next section then, there is this issue of who is a customer for an electric utility. So for years and years, actually for decades, for the better part of the century, I could say, there was no consideration given to the fact that customers have diverse needs. In the last 10 to 15 years, utilities have begun to pay attention to the fact that customers do have diverse needs when it comes to electricity. They certainly have diverse needs for everything else. Some want a car and some don't want a car. Some want, this kind of Starbucks coffee and some want some other kind of Starbucks coffee. There's human diversity in everything. So why should electricity be different? Well, this realization has now been accepted, and utilities have done a lot of market research on their customers, and they have found out that some customers want the lowest bill. They're willing to be flexible in the manner in which they use electricity. In other words, they're willing to take either a time of use rate or a dynamic pricing rate, and I will define those terms shortly, in order to lower their bill. They have flexibility in their lifestyle or in their business. On the other hand, there are some customers, and they could be in the same neighborhood. They might even be relatives of each other. They don't want that lowest bill. They just want to have a guaranteed bill. They want to lock it in for peace of mind, and they're willing to pay a premium for that. And many utilities offer these choices, and typically what we find is about 10 to 15 to 20% of the customers want to have the lowest bill. And then there are 10 to 20% of the customers who want to have a guaranteed bill. And so there are bookends, if you will, of the customer preferences that we have for buying electricity and for bill management. Most customers, of course, lie in between. Some want a guaranteed bill. They're willing to pay more for it to lock it in, like a fixed rate mortgage versus an adjustable rate mortgage. But they might be willing to lower it during times when the system has a peak demand problem. If they're offered a rebate, like you will be paid $20 a month if you allow the utility to control your thermostat or your air conditioner compressor cycle 5 times a month. Okay? If you allow adjustments to be made 10 times a month, you might be paid double the amount. So many utilities offer those kinds of programs, and they find that many customers are eager to go for those, and some of them want a guaranteed bill, but they're willing to lower it by agreeing to these rebate-based programs. And then there are other customers who want to subscribe to a given level of demand. Like they'll say, okay, I'm not going to go over 4 kW demand. Their meter is capable of measuring demand, and demand is what really causes the blackouts if you exceed demand. So they're willing to subscribe to a given level of demand and make sure they don't go over that. And that concept is very popular in Europe. It is now being also tried out in certain US areas. So the point of this slide simply is that your customers, I'm sure, are no different than customers anywhere else in the US. They have diverse tastes, and the way to meet that diversity of preferences is to offer them different rate designs. Next slide, please. Utilities, as a result of all that market research, are rethinking rate design, and there are 2 reasons for that. One is to improve customer satisfaction by giving them what they want. The different customers will have different wants and therefore should have different rates. And also to improve cost reflectivity, which is the balance between fixed cost and variable costs. So the conventional options already touched upon, flat rates, including the rates that go up with usage and seasonal rates, they're all called flat rates. Increasing the fixed charge to improve the balance between fixed costs and fixed revenue. Introducing demand charges to start recovering some of the capacity costs through a demand charge, as opposed to through a volumetric or energy charge. In other words, making the rates look more and more like the rates for commercial and industrial customers, now that advanced metering has been rolled out to 100 million customers in the US. And then there is this issue of net metering, which has to do with how do you compensate solar customers for the energy that they're buying, as well as the energy that they're exporting back to the grid. Those are all part of what I'm calling conventional options. Each one of them is there today, either for all classes of customers or just for C&I customers. What's new and innovative is listed next on the slide. The first one is time of use rates. And these time of use rates vary the price by pricing period. So if you have more load in the summer afternoons, it's more expensive to meet that load. It's like congestion. Then what you do is you have a higher peak period price and a lower off-peak period price. Those are time of use rates. But it's the same rate every day in the summer season, and it might be a different rate in the winter season, but it doesn't vary day to day. So then you have dynamic pricing, like the Oklahoma example I gave you, where 20% of their customers are on that rate. They save about 20% on their monthly bills through the lower off-peak rates that are available to them, and they reduce their peak load on average by 40%. That's huge. So they have smart thermostats combined with rates, and that's what allows it to happen. And then you have a concept called peak time rebates. And this is very popular in Maryland and in a few other states. So what you do to the customer is you say, you know, the utility grid is stressed, it's very hot, the demand is just going through the roof, we won't be able to match demand and supply, and we could risk having a blackout. So if you agree to curtail your air conditioning use or curtail whatever other use you have, it's up to you as the customer to decide, then we are going to give you a rebate for every kilowatt hour that you cut back. And so in the case of Baltimore Gas and Electric Company, for example, they will give the customer a rebate of $1.25 per kilowatt hour curtailed during those peak demand events. The average price of electricity otherwise is 15 cents. they're willing to pay you $1.25 to cut your use. It's like a rebate. And so they find that about 88% of their customers are taking advantage of those rebates, and they're reducing their peak demands by about 18 to 20%. So these are the new innovative options, and their purpose is, number one, to improve cost reflectivity, the balance between fixed and variable, and number two, to better manage peaks so that blackouts don't occur. And also, by the way, sometimes instead of a blackout, a utility will say, look, I will have to buy power from someone else. It's a very expensive time. So they buy the expensive power to keep the lights on, but then everybody's bill ultimately has to go up. So that's not an attractive solution either. And that's where these rates can come in, which incentivize the customer to manage their use, to lower costs for all customers, and to avoid blackouts. Next, please. So I'm going to, at a high level, just summarize some of these rate designs in a tabular format. I already have mentioned several of these, so I won't go into the details, but the slides you will have for reference, and then we'll take a break for questions. So the first one is, I'm calling it a fixed bill or a subscription plan. And again, this is already there. Utilities like Georgia Power, Duke Energy in Indiana, Oklahoma Gas and Electric. These are examples of utilities that offer this product. If your historical average was $100, you can lock it in at $110. And then you don't have to worry about year-to-year swings. This plays to the concept of bill stability. There is no true up at the end of the year, so it's different from the balanced monthly payment plan. So that's the fixed bill or subscription plan. And then you have seasonal rates. So the seasonal rates, as the name implies, just charge a different price between, let's say, the winter and summer months. If you're summer peaking, then the summer rates will be a bit higher. Then you have demand charges, where you pay as a customer based on your peak electricity consumption, which is measured over a 15-minute or a 30-minute or a 60-minute interval. It's not instantaneous demand, it's over a short period of time. It's called a demand charge, and we have about 60 or so demand charges being offered to residential customers by utilities in the US. A lot of cooperatives do it, and some municipal utilities do it, and some investor-owned utilities do it. So these are 3 rates to just keep in mind, and we'll come back to these during the discussion to get your input on these. Next slide, please. The next one on the list is a time of use rate, and you divide the day into a peak and an off-peak period, and prices are higher during the peak period to reflect the higher cost of supplying power during that period. It's the same rate day to day, it doesn't change. And then you have critical peak pricing. That's more like the Oklahoma kind I was describing. On certain days, typically no more than 10 to 15 days, when the system is stressed because of shortages or higher costs, you say to the customer, these are the days when it's really expensive, so please try to use less during the peak period. The other option is the mirror image of this, but is expressed as a rebate. And that's the one that I mentioned to you in Maryland that Baltimore Gas and Electric and Pepco have, where the customer is given a pretty significant rebate to lower their usage. But if they don't lower their usage, their price doesn't go up. All they do is they lose the rebate. Okay, so it's a bit more customer friendly, if you will. Okay, next slide, please. Then comes variable peak pricing, and that's Oklahoma. And what Oklahoma does, it has a sophisticated form of critical peak pricing where the price could rise to level 1 or rise further to level 2 or 3 or 4. So there are 4 different levels of this high price. And the 4 different levels are the ones that with the smart thermostat, customers are using to really manage their bills. And that's where the 40% reduction in peak demand occurs when the price is really high and you get 20% a month average customer bill savings. So the purpose of these rates is not just to charge a higher price to customers, but to help them lower their bills by modifying their usage profile to the extent that they can. By the way, not every customer wants to do it. Not every customer is on those rates, but there are enough customers on the rates that you could actually have such significant reductions in your demand that you may not need to buy new peaking capacity. And that's the rationale that many utilities have for offering these rates. Transactive energy is a complex form of rate design. I'm going to skip that, come back to it if people are interested in it. I will mention real-time pricing because I'm sure all of you are aware of it based on what happened to Griddy in Texas during the Valentine's Day freeze that occurred. Unfortunately, the version of real-time pricing they had was capped with a very high number. I don't know why you'd have a price of $9 per kilowatt hour for residential customers under any conditions. They should have designed it so that it would not really go above even $2. They should have hedged it. It was hedged, but at such a high level that, as you, I'm sure, are all familiar, much too familiar, some customers had bills in the thousands of dollars. And that's not the kind of real-time pricing I'm talking about. That was real-time pricing out of control. It should be managed so that it is affordable by residential customers. Even by industrial and commercial customers. For example, in the state of Georgia, they have some 2,600 customers on real-time pricing. And those customers also have potential exposure to an unlimited ceiling. So each one of them has a cap on what the price can go up to. Even though they are large industrial customers, even then they have caps there that are much more feasible. And so on average in Georgia, for those C&I customers, if the price goes above $1 a kilowatt hour, their load drops by 17%. And it is designed in such a way that it helps the customer with a lower bill. That's why the customers sign on to it. It's entirely a voluntary program. The utility benefits by not having to buy expensive power during those really expensive hours. So each of these has pluses and minuses. Some customers will go for option fixed bill. Other customers will go for option real-time pricing. All of the others will be somewhere in between. And that's the texture and flavor of these modern rate designs. And let's go to the next slide. Okay, as I thought. So this is our chance to take your questions on these rate designs that I've presented thus far. I know it's a lot of information that I have presented. Some of it might be familiar to you, some of it might not be. So go ahead and let me know if you have any specific questions about the rates that I was talking about, or if you have any other rate that you want to recommend.
Dr. Faruqi, this is Chad. Just a couple of follow-up comments or observations. You know, the rate designs that you're telling us about that are employed by different utilities, the utilities are creating options and flexibility for their customers. They're not forcing them into specific rate structures. They're trying to give them the tools that customers have said that they want to manage their bills. And in the process, accomplish some of the utilities' objectives of managing the grid and managing their generation assets. So that's sort of the first thing that I would say. And then I also must tell you, Dr. Faruqi, I've committed you to something. Anne Marie in the chat asked about customer satisfaction of the different rate designs. So as you get into the case studies later this evening, please make sure to speak to, you know, your knowledge of how customers perceived the rollout and the experience of those different rate designs.
Excellent points. Absolutely, I will. And just at a very high level, I would say that the primary purpose for utilities to introduce these diverse rates was exactly as you said, was to meet the diverse needs of different customers. Some wanted stability and some wanted lower bills. You cannot get both of them together. You have to get one or the other. And so utilities are offering these choices. Like the most recent choices being offered are in the state of Missouri, where Ameren, Missouri has offered customers 3 different kinds of time of use rates. They differ. One rate has 3 pricing periods, another one has 2 pricing periods. And the one that has 3 pricing periods has a much lower off-peak price during the nighttime hours, so that if you have an electric car, for example, you can charge it at a much lower rate. Now, if you don't have an electric car, you can go with the 2-period time of use rate. And by the way, these rates are options being offered. You can stay with your current rate, which is like a standard flat rate. And then they have introduced also yet another rate, which has a demand charge or a capacity charge in it to improve cost reflectivity. And the reason they have done it is partly so that cost reflectivity is better, but also because with the demand charge in your rate structure, you get a lower energy charge. So if you can manage your demand, and it's very simple, don't run all your major appliances at the same time is the message. So if you have an air conditioner and a dishwasher and a clothes dryer and a washing machine and a microwave oven, don't run all of them at the same time, because that'll really spike your demand. So as long as you manage your demand, your energy costs go lower. So just spread the load, and then it'll cost you less to do some more cooking or to relax a bit more with your lights and TVs and so on. You can leave them on a little longer. It'll also encourage you perhaps to buy a heat pump instead of a conventional air conditioner. So it incentivizes the electrification, which again contributes to the decarbonization goal. And that's just one example of many. And then we'll get to the case study shortly. Were there any other questions on this that I am missing here? I'm trying to read the chat here as well. But chat, did anything did I miss anything here?
Well, we're starting to get questions here pretty quickly. It's just challenging to keep up. But Peter asked a question about CCP, I think he means CPP, critical peak pricing, and demand charges. Is there a difference between them?
Yes, there is. So critical peak pricing applies only to the energy charge. It doesn't have a demand charge element to it. So if the customer is consuming 1,000 kilowatt hours a month, and 200 of those are during the peak period, and 100 of those are during the critical peak hours, then it is all expressed in kilowatt hours. It only applies to energy. Demand charges are expressed not in energy, but in demand, which is kW as opposed to kWh. And so what's being measured with the demand charge is how high was your demand. I'll give you an example. In my house, I have an air conditioner, I have a clothes dryer, I have an electric car. If I run all of those at the same time, my demand literally goes through the roof. It'll go above 10 kW because the car by itself is 6 kW and the clothes dryer is another 6 kW. So if I have a demand charge, which I don't, most residential customers don't, I pay attention to not running them at the same time. But if I don't have a demand charge, it doesn't matter. But if I have critical peak pricing, I do have a similar incentive, which is not to run more appliances during the critical peak hours. So if the critical peak hours, so in California, they have a lot of solar, they have the so-called duck curve, and the peak period actually begins at 4 p.m. and goes until 9 p.m. So if I'm in a critical peak pricing rate, which I was a few years ago, then I would never run all of those loads during the critical peak hours. They're discretionary loads. Why should I charge my car or run my clothes dryer when it's costing me 5 times as much as it would otherwise? So we have found that if you charge the customer to critical peak pricing 5 times more than the off-peak rate, then you get a reduction of about 12% in that customer's energy use. On the other hand, if it's a simple time of use rate where the peak price is twice as high, then you get a reduction that'd be more like 3 or 4%. So customer response clearly is driven by the magnitude of the difference in prices. And we have data from nearly 400 pricing experiments and deployments that has allowed us to establish those relationships. If there's interest in that, I can come back to it or provide information via email later on.
Dr. Farooqui, there was, Peter had a sort of a follow-up question, which I can help address. How does demand charge apply to residential versus commercial? I would say demand cost applies to residential and commercial. So everybody drives costs into the system based on the demands they place on the system. But what we find and what utilities all over the place have found is that demand charges are really hard to wrap your head around. For the average person, they're just complicated. And so tactics like critical peak pricing have become sort of a proxy for demand charges for residential customers. And then the next question, Anita, yes, and we will show that. Every time we consider a different rate design, we run through, it's my team runs through many simulations by usage level, by income, as many of the demographic information as we have, single family, multifamily, because we do want to understand every time you change a rate design, you have a different impact on different types of customers, and we want to understand that before making that change. And that would be something we would bring to this group if we were recommending, a change in our rate structure.
Great. Thank you very much. And there was another question I noticed about the customers having choices, but can they try before they buy and move between different programs? So I can answer that at a high level, and Chad, you might want to elaborate within the CPS context. So those utilities that are offering choices to customers, some of them will say to the customer, you can try this out and we can measure what your bill would have been on the old rate versus the new rate, and we will let you know which one was the better choice for you. And if this was not the best choice for you, you can get off this rate and try something else. That's one approach. Another approach is, well, we're going to give you bill protection, and so you will still pay the lower of the two bills. A few utilities do that, but that's very rare. It's the so-called bill protection concept. Was there a question or a comment while I was speaking?
No, I don't think so. Al
Okay.
Rodriguez asked a follow-up question in the chat that was very similar to that question that you just answered. And
okay.
we found the same thing, Dr. Faruqi, as we look around at new rate structures and pilots that other utilities have run. They generally are customer friendly. They're not going to force somebody onto a pilot, and if they have a really horrible experience, they're going to do right by the customer. And we would do the exact same thing.
Got you. And I was going to just add one more footnote, if you will, which is that if you are a customer who has an advanced meter, and so your load shape is available to the utility, then some utilities have a tool where you can pick the best rate for you based on your load shape. In other words, your consumption behavior during the past 1 year. And if they have 3 rate choices, they will calculate your bill for you on each of the 3 different rate options and tell you this is your lowest rate option. And then you just click on that, and that becomes your rate. That practice is not as widespread as you might think it is, but it's certainly there. Some utilities have it, and I believe more and more utilities are beginning to move in that direction of having a bill calculator that lets you pick the best rate for you. Now, the limitation with those calculators is based on your last year's usage, and your next year's usage might be different because you buy new appliances, or you have an addition to the family, or you remodel the house. So it is still somewhat based on your last year. There are very few tools available for predicting which would be your best rate if you remodel your house, or if you have an addition to the family. Those tools are being created in labs, but typically they're not yet available through utilities. So I thought I'd just add that comment. Chad, have we covered all the major questions?
I believe we're caught up, yes.
Okay, good. And certainly, if questions occur to you afterwards, you can, I guess, post them, and if we run out of time, we'll address them after the meeting. Okay.
Yeah, and just so everybody knows, we will export the text in the chat, and we will, after this meeting, go back and make sure that we have documented or answered every question. So if for some reason there's too many questions coming too quickly and we skip you, we apologize, but we will get back to you.
Thank you. And honestly, I know sometimes I may miss a question. It's not by design or deliberately. It's just, I cannot do 2 things at the same time. So certainly let me know if your question was not asked, and either I or Chad or one of the CPS team members will respond as best as we can during the session. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. So this is a question that in a sense we already have answered, but let me go through it quickly just for reference. Why are we talking about changes in rate design? Not just in the US, by the way, but throughout the globe. I did a survey last year of 40 utilities around the globe, and 20 of them responded back to me. I just wanted to see if this was only a US phenomenon or a global phenomenon, this desire to change rates, particularly for mass market customers. And I was amazed at just about every utility from Africa to Latin America to Europe to Asia. They're all in the process of modifying their rates. So why is that the case? Number one driver is digital technologies have arrived, and more customers have smart appliances. They have Wi-Fi thermostats. They have all kinds of technologies that talk to each other. And so the opportunity is there to leverage that technology revolution and use it to help lower customers' bills while also making the grid more reliable. And therefore, it's a win-win. A second driver is the greening of customer tastes. We have a lot of research on this topic that shows that as the generations turn over, the newer generations are more and more into what is called organic conservation. You don't even have to tell them to conserve. They will conserve on their own. The attitudes of customers are dramatically changing. I mean, I've been in this business now for 42 years, and I've seen that change dramatically with every passing decade. Doesn't matter which state you look at or which country you look at, that's a universal phenomenon. Another driver is the desire by customers to have options or choices. Choices from a utility in rate design. I'm not talking about retail choice of providers. That's a different question altogether. This is just options in rate design. So those are three important drivers. And what is the enabler is the rollout of smart meters. They can offer these rates much more readily than you could with the simple old analog meters that were widespread throughout the US. The US is about 138 million households. As I mentioned, about 100 million of those now have smart meters. So the challenge is these drivers actually have implications for utility revenues. And utilities have to adjust their rate designs in order to continue providing service, because a big driver when you have greening of taste and you have more efficient appliances in houses, consumption stops growing. And I'm sure we've all seen that curve where growth has slowed down. And it's going to slow down even more as this greening phenomena occurs and digitalization occurs. So the utility business model, which is based largely on volumetric recovery of fixed cost revenue, will no longer be viable in 5 to 10 years. It has to change. And that's where this rate design adjustment can also help facilitate the transition to the newer business model. Next slide. So just to give you a quick snapshot, and we're going to dive into the case studies. I have gone over the list of rate options with you earlier: flat bill or fixed bill, peak time rebates, demand charges, time of use volumetric rates, and dynamic volumetric rates. If we just focus on those, that's a subset of what I showed you previously. We have examples of these spread out across the states. And I will dive into those in a moment. But let me tell you one other important policy issue that a utility has to make, sometimes the regulatory body or the board for a municipal utility, is how should the rates be offered? Should they be mandatory? In other words, there is no choice. Should they be opt-out, sometimes called default, or should they be opt-in? Historically, all of these new rate options have been opt-in, but more and more, we are seeing a movement towards opt-out deployment, in particular, of time of use rates. And so in the states like Maryland and California and Illinois, opt-out for peak time rebates is the default setting. And then when you come to time of use volumetric rates, SMUD, Sacramento Municipal Utilities District with 500,000 customers, has now had opt-out time of use rates for 2 years, and I'll have details on that for you shortly. Fort Collins, another municipal utility, a smaller one in Colorado, actually has mandatory time of use rates. And of course, you know very well that in Texas, the time of use rates as an opt-in option are very widespread, particularly in the ERCOT region. And then we come to the dynamic volumetric rates. So in California, for large customers, C&I customers, critical peak pricing is the default tariff. And as far as Oklahoma and Illinois go, they have real-time pricing as an opt-in tariff. Illinois has opt-in real-time pricing. Oklahoma has opt-in CPP. So that's just a quick snapshot that this is not something that just the academics are discussing or the researchers. This is actually in the field, and it has been going on now, at least in California, for 2 decades, in Maryland for a decade and a half, and in places like the others shown here in the last 5 to 7 years. Next slide. So in terms of the major trends, there are 3 major trends that are worth briefly touching upon. The first one, as we have discussed earlier, is a desire to move fixed charges closer to fixed costs. So instead of collecting $5 a month from the customer, if the fixed cost is $25 a month, which by the way tends to be the number that more and more utilities have in their rate cases, then we try to move it closer. So this is a chart drawn from a national survey of investor-owned utilities of what has been going on. And in the numbers vary across the years, 2018, 2019, and 2020. And in many cases, no increase was approved. In some cases, a partial increase was approved. In fewer cases, a full increase was approved. And so it's sort of a mixed bag. Investor-owned utilities have a really hard time getting this change implemented. In California, 2 of the investor-owned utilities have a $0 per month fixed charge. The third one has a $1 a month fixed charge. But Sacramento Municipal has a fixed charge of above $20. Their number used to be, I believe, around $7, but over a 5-year period, they gradually raised it. And I've seen other municipal utilities also having much more success in achieving this goal of moving fixed charges closer to fixed costs. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to pause here and see if there are any questions, I guess, either on the fixed charge slide that I was just putting up there, the desire to move revenue closer to cost in terms of structure, or the other rate designs I was reviewing earlier.
Mr. Faruqi, it's Dana McGinnis. You've put out a lot of data about what other utilities and regions are doing. Is it possible to weigh in and see which ones you would deem as successful and which ones are not so successful? That way we would have some kind of idea of what to do or what not to do. I mean, there seem to be a lot of issues, not only in Texas, but around the country with rates and power outages and everything else. And so you think it would be useful for us, or can you even gather the information to say, well, they did this with this objective and it worked really well because of this, or it didn't work because, you know, the blackouts got worse, or something like that? Don't you think that would be useful?
Absolutely. In other words, what are the lessons learned?
Yes.
Absolutely. So here's what I suggest we do. I have a few case studies, and when I do the case studies, I'll bring out the successes and failures to some extent for those utilities, but I can also do a broader lessons learned. I actually have the draft of a short article I have been writing on the subject. And why don't I talk to the CPS folks and see what is the best way for me to summarize the lessons learned, because we have, particularly since the California energy crisis that took place in the year 2000 and 2001, we have had a lot of innovations. Some have succeeded and some have not. And by the way, I'll make a couple of general comments if I might. If you were to ask me just point blank, is there a winning rate design out there that everyone who has tried it has succeeded with it? If so, what is that rate design? In other words, is there a magical win here? My answer is no. However, there are many successes. And what I have observed is you can have the best rate design and you market it poorly. The customers don't adopt it, or they don't know what it is. They just drop out of it, or they don't respond to it. So with the same rate design, I have seen successes and I have seen failures. I'll give you an example. I mean, just very specific. The OG&E example is an incredible example of success because they put a lot of time and effort in talking to their customers before they even designed it. How many periods should you have? What should be the discount in the off-peak? What should be the premium in the peak? Should it be summer only? Should it be year-round? They did all of that hard work, and when they offered it, it was an immediate success. In just 3 years, they got 20% of the people signed up. Give you another example. A similar and simpler rate was tried out in California by the 3 investor-owned utilities. So, was there a comment there?
No, Dr. Fergie, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt. I was just going to point out there's a couple of questions in the chat, if you want to tackle those. So Dee Dee posed the question, doesn't increasing fixed charges reduce the financial benefit of energy conservation?
So that comes up a lot. The question is, to what extent is energy conservation economically efficient? You don't want to over-conserve, right? You don't want to under-conserve or over-conserve. So what is the rule? The rule is base your price of electric energy, on the cost of electric energy. And if that average cost number or marginal cost number for energy is lower than your fully loaded rate, then why should the customer be given a price of 10 cents instead of 5 or 7 cents if that is what your energy cost really is? The energy cost is your fuel cost. You should recover the fuel cost through the volumetric charge, but what ends up happening is you're recovering the cost of your generation, transmission, distribution capacity through that energy charge, and that's why it's double the amount. So that's not very efficient. You're over-incentivizing energy conservation if you load the fixed cost into the energy cost. And I didn't mean to not answer Dana's question, but it's a longer story. So perhaps the approach I have, Dana, if that's acceptable to you, is I'll do the case studies tonight, and then I will try to get that longer paper written up and shared with the entire RAC membership. And then we can dive into it later on in another RAC meeting. Because
well, thank you. I think it'd be quite useful for us to look at so we don't invent the wheel, so to speak. And there is something to be learned.
Believe me, I used to have a full head of hair when I started this work. I've lost most of it, and I have learned a lot of lessons in return for the lost hair. So I'm more than happy to share successes and failures. And by the way, Chad, was there another question that I should be addressing?
I also have a question.
Go ahead, Anita.
I'm sorry. I don't know if it's a question so much, I'm kind of thinking out loud here, and I'm going to go very kind of high level thinking. I've just been thinking about a lot of the information that we've been learning, and thank you so much for the presentation. These last few slides were very, very helpful for me. And one of the things that I was thinking about on, again, a very high level is, what we've learned, right? We're running off of a cost of service model, right? We're balancing our expenses and our revenue. That's generally the idea. For me, when we talk about rate structures, and really an implied a potential rate increase, for me, it more specifically is talking about increasing our revenue or adjusting our revenue to meet our growing expenses, right? Well, we've learned that a big chunk of our expenses, and we have many, is our fuel cost. And one of the things that in recent history that we've all learned is about, we talked at one of the first meetings about the fifth fuel, which is conservation, and the impact that had on our service. So, when we start talking about rate structures, and this may be, again, it kind of a, hope I'm not talking too abstractly here, but I would like to really kind of open up the discussion or learning more about, kind of a combination strategy where, it's like, listen, if we're going into this whole thing, it's either we're going to decrease our expenses or we're going to increase our revenue. That's how we're going to have a balanced cost of service. So can we open it up a little bit to talk about reducing expenses through an investment, continuing to do that through conservation and future technology, because our fuel sources are so variable and so volatile that it seems that will become harder and harder to predict as we move out. So again, renewable energy technology, batteries, all the things that we talk about in Flex Step. We've seen the success of STEP in the past and our investment in conservation. I guess that's a broad statement. I know I'm throwing a lot out there, but it was just something I feel like, this is kind of, for me, a new path forward and something that we really need to take into account when we start talking about the rate structure of the future.
A good point. It's basically what you're raising is what should be the principles guiding rate design, and what you were just saying. You're saying should be a principle that guides the choice of rate design, and I agree with you. And what I would suggest we do is answer your question in stages, because it's a complex question. It's an all-embracing question. So I'll address it to some extent with rate design. Then the next RAC meeting on the 22nd is going to go deeper into cost of service. And how do you use that to allocate your costs and meet your revenue requirements? And then the meeting that will come after that will be CPS focused, where all of this foundational education will then be drawn upon by the CPS speakers to indicate what their plan is to best meet the needs of their customers. That's my suggestion, but Chad, certainly feel free to comment.
Can I add something? Oh, sorry.
One quick comment. I think that's right, Dr. Faruqi. And what we'll show is throughout the rest of the summer, we will show sort of the trade-offs, right? The cost benefit. What do you get for how much it costs? And is that trade-off acceptable to the community? Like those are the decisions. When Dr. Faruqi says it depends on the guiding principles of rate design, that's what he means.
Excellent. I think there was one question I was reading in the chat box about paralysis by analysis. In other words, having too many choices being offered to customers. And I'm certainly not suggesting that all of these choices be offered to customers. I'm saying this is the universe of choices. You need to do sort of like a screening of these and pick maybe 3 or 4 choices to offer to your customers. That's something we will get later into when I discuss the case studies, which will come up soon, as to how other utilities have done it. Because having no choice is bad, but having too many choices is equally bad.
And Dr. Femi, I cut you off earlier, so I want to make sure we give you an opportunity to ask your question.
Yeah, no problem. I mean, so a lot of the questions that I had in mind actually have been asked one way or the other, or have been addressed. But I wanted to sort of point out something at the risk of being somewhat philosophical, but I know Dr. Faruqi said somewhere back in slide 12, that these drivers are impacting utility financial models. We may see changes in the next 5 to 10 years because of several changes, several of the drivers of changes that we're seeing. And that got me thinking about something that I see very regularly in CPS Energy's presentations, where you compare our rates to the rates in other parts of Texas and other parts of the country. And I'm trying to imagine that with these options that are now available, that we may be putting forward to our customers, will there be a value in comparing anymore? And what would those parameters be for comparing our rates? Because you're about to go into case studies, I'm in my mind thinking, how do we begin to compare? How do we get to the apples to apples type of thing when we know that there are different financial models, there are different things that may be coming available to the utilities? I mean, what does it mean anymore to compare? To the extent you can address that in your case studies, I'd like to sort of get some insight. And it may not be a question to be answered today. It may just come up recurrently as we go through these various education and decision-making steps.
Yeah, that's really a very important question having to do with the business model. And what does it mean to be competitive or not competitive? Who are you competing with? Are you competing with your neighboring utilities? Or are you competing with a customer who now has digital technologies and is using only half as much energy as they previously used to? Or are you competing with a customer who has solar and battery storage? So their cost is really low and they're buying less and less from you. I have been part of 2 recent webinars where that has been the sole focus of the discussion, is what are the forces that are disrupting the utility business model? One of them was in Canada, actually, virtual, of course, and it was called the 4 Ds. And the 5th D was I mean, this is a metaphor, is if you don't address these 4Ds, the fifth D will come into the room, and that's the D of death. So what were the first 4Ds? One is digitalization. The second is the emergence of democracy, democratization of energy, people having their own energy resources. And then there was the third one was the distributed energy resources like solar and so on and so forth. And so you have, and then I was talking to a person in New Zealand, and he said we have 8 Ds happening. So these Ds stand for destruction, and they're going to destroy not the utility, but the current business model of the utility, unless a lot of steps are taken to get ahead of change. And one of those is change the rate design, so it's more in line with your cost structure. If your cost structure does not align with your rate structure, you have a number one problem, but you also have a problem if your costs are too high relative to the customer's other alternative. So I mean, these are serious challenges that need to be addressed. But it's sort of, I think it's too broad of a question to address here, but hopefully we will address it by the time the third or fourth session is occurring.
So Dr. Faruqi, just looking at our time, we've got about 30 minutes left since we don't have any public comment tonight. You have 2 more slides of rate design before we get to case studies. But a lot of the questions we're getting tonight, I think are part of a case study discussion. So I think your next slide is about demand charges, which we may have covered sufficiently. Maybe talk about the time of use slide, and then maybe let's jump into the case studies.
Excellent suggestion. Yeah, I was looking at the clock. So why don't we go to the next slide? And I believe that is on demand charges, as you were saying. And so as I've introduced the concept of demand, and I mentioned it is fairly common in Europe, is based on the size of the connection as opposed to the customer's actual demand. So in places like France, Italy, and Spain, since the Second World War ended, they've had shortages. And so for electric capacity, in other words, so much was destroyed. So what they did was they said, we need to balance demand and supply, and we're going to have a charge for you based on the connected load. It was measured in amps or kVA. Demand charges in the US have begun to be offered, and now we have more than 50 utilities across 24 states offering them to residential customers. And some of them offer more than one demand charge. So there are actually more than 60 demand charges being offered today in the US. Most of them are by cooperatives, a few by municipalities, and the most significant of the municipalities is the large one, Salt River Project in Arizona. And then, of course, Arizona Public Service, the investor-owned utility there, they have about, I believe, 20 to 30% of their customers on demand charges. So demand charges are simply a desire to make the rate more cost reflective, and the messaging has to be simple to the customer. Most people are not engineers, or even if they are engineers, they don't want to think about engineering in their house. And so the messaging is don't run all your appliances at the same time. You'll avoid paying a high demand charge, and now you have a lower energy charge, so you can relax a little bit and focus more on, you know, the good things in life as far as energy goes. So that's sort of a quick comment on demand charges. Next. Okay, should we skip this discussion and combine it with the time of use discussion in the interest of time?
Yes, go on, please.
Excellent, thank you. So I think by now you must have picked up the fact that I keep referring to time varying rates quite a bit, and that's simply because just about every utility in the US that I have talked to at conferences, webinars, or as clients, they're looking at time of use rates. This has been around, by the way, this rate structure since the 1950s, but the absence of smart meters made it difficult to offer it to residential customers. So the US government has the Energy Information Administration, and they have a Form 861, and they indicate that 365 US utilities offer at least one form of time varying rate, and that's back in 2019. The survey has a bit of a lag, probably the number's gone up. But if you count the number of customers today, it's only 6 million. So it's 4.5% as of roughly last year. But in 5 years, we're expecting the percentage to go up to 15% because This will now be rolled out as the default rate in many states like California, Colorado, and Illinois, Michigan, and that's going to really raise the percentage. So we're going to get more into this as we get into the case study. So next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to pause here just to see if at a high level there are any comments on these two rate designs.
Dr. Faruqi, Peter has a question about time of use, so it's relevant to this slide. Can you explain your comment on how reductions in consumption will affect time of use volumetric rate design in the future?
So what I was saying was that there is a reduction in consumption that is happening, and that's going to affect the recovery of utility revenues if volumetric revenue is all we have. So the time of use rate, which is volumetric, will not change that reality. For the time of use rate to have an effect, it'll have to be combined with a demand charge, which is what, for example, Arizona Public Service has done and what some other utilities are doing. So as long as the rate structure is volumetric, doesn't matter whether it's time of use or flat, it will not solve the business model issue. It will lower costs a little bit, but it won't really prevent the business model from blowing up, if you will. Okay, the last question I'm seeing here, any research being done that shows that the average residential customer is able to understand and respond to demand charges? So the best answer I can give you is the following. Most customers have no clue about demand, right? However, if you tell them that a light bulb that says 100 watts, that the 100 watts is a measure of demand, and if you run that light bulb for 10 hours, you would have consumed 1,000 kilowatt hours, and if your price of electricity is 10 cents, then that's what you'll be paying for that kilowatt hour. But in order to tell them what is a kilowatt hour, we had to start with a light bulb whose capacity is demand. So there is no reason why they won't understand it if you explain it. But yes, off the top of my mind, based on all the research I've seen, people say, what is demand? Are you charging me twice for the same product, which is electricity? So it does require explanation. There's no doubt about it. It requires videos and it requires a good marketing collateral, but the successes are out there. We have 64 demand charges being successfully adopted by customers who are residential customers, especially if you think about the cooperatives which serve rural areas. Those customers grasp it and understand it. So why would they not understand it in urban areas? With the right marketing messaging, they should be able to.
Yeah, just to add to that, Dee, we've seen the utilities that have success are highly communicative to their customers. They hold, community input sessions to talk about it and teach it. And they have customers that are engaged in it and they offer opt-out options. Really, they work very hard to create a customer experience that makes sense. And then the failure stories are basically the opposite. Utilities that just did it because it was a cost-driven principle and they didn't talk much about it and they kind of snuck it through their regulator, just got it done. There's huge backlash in those situations, but that's what you would expect.
Yeah, and what you just said, Chad, even applies to time of use rates. Many utilities have a time of use rate, but all they do is put it in the rate booklet. It's on the website. They never market it. The customer doesn't even know what it is. So it's no surprise that no customer other than 10 customers are on it. All of those 10 work at the utility. So marketing is absolutely the key here. It's like with any new product. You have to educate and inform the customer. You have to do focus groups and market research to understand what vocabulary to use, what metaphors to use, and how to bring social media into the picture. So one comment is you can't have too much stakeholder engagement. Absolutely, I agree 100% with that. And the last 5 projects I've been doing on rate design, the good news is all of the utilities that I've been working with on those have realized the importance of stakeholder engagement. In the past, it used to be that they would just convince their commission or their board and the rate would get approved, but they would never talk to customers. And there are so many stories on that we'll save it for a longer conversation some other time. The failures outnumber the successes, believe me, 10 to 1. But the good news is the new successes we have are very encouraging. And let me get into the case studies with that perspective in mind in the time that remains. Next slide, please. So Sacramento Municipal, this utility is incredible. It is one of the best utilities in the state of California in terms of customer satisfaction, in terms of the products it is offering. Also, it has lower rates than the investor-owned utilities. For all kinds of reasons, people really love to talk about SMUD. But until a few years ago, they had low fixed charges and they did not have time of use rates. They did some research, they did some pilots, they did some focus groups, they revisited their cost of service study, and they said, we're going to raise our fixed charge, and they gradually raised it over a few years to something like $20 a month now. I think it may be slightly higher now. But the other story that they have is they have transitioned all of their customers away from the inclining block rate that they used to have, which was a traditional inclining block rate designed to promote energy conservation. Most people didn't understand the rate. It's not clear how much conservation occurred. And then they concluded it was not reflective of their cost structure. Their cost structure, it's a summer peaking utility, very hot summers in Sacramento. I used to work there for 2 years at the California Energy Commission, so I can tell you from firsthand experience, that area is really hot. They conducted a very successful pilot program in 2012 and 2013, testing various kinds of TOU, CPP, and combination TOU, CPP rates. And they concluded that TOU was really good. So they educated and informed their customers over a 3-year period that this is coming, this is good for you, this will lower your bills, here's how you live your life at TOU. It doesn't mean that you suddenly unplug everything during the peak period. All it means is you adjust your thermostat by 1 or 2 degrees, you don't run your clothes dryer during the peak window and a few other items, and you will be able to save. Yes, they have smart meters. That was one of the questions. They have smart meters. You couldn't do this without smart meters. So what they have done is they have actually rolled it out. So it is the default rate for all of their customers. And only, I believe, 4% have opted out in the last 2 years. The other 96% are on that rate. Their analysis of the first summer shows that customers reduced the residential peak by 8%. Which is a humongous reduction in peak, saves money for everyone. The customers saved about $3 per month on their summer electric bill. Now you might say that's nothing, but everything adds up. It's $3 per month, and you have a 6-month summer, you're saving almost $20. You might say, I don't care, which is fine. Some people don't save anything. But on average, they're saving $3 per month, which means that some are saving a lot more. And 96% stayed on the TOU rate. So it's a real success story. Next one. Then we have the investor-owned utilities. They serve about 10 million customers. And they are transitioning all their customers to default time of use rates, just like SMUD. But they're doing it at a slower pace because they have so many more customers. And they are doing it with a peak to off-peak ratio in their rate, which is very mild. It's about 20%. Peak is higher, 20%. Whereas in the case of SMUD, their peak is higher by 2.5 times. In other words, the discount is much bigger in the SMUD service area than it is for the investor-owned utilities. So I have been part of this case for years and years. I am a customer, and of course, I live in California since 1974. I just wish they were doing something more exciting. My fear is this will not be viewed as a success story because customers will try to shift load and find out they're saving next to nothing, and they'll be very annoyed. And believe me, this is exactly what happened 20 years ago up in Puget Sound Energy. So that's an investor-owned utility that serves the customers around the city of Seattle. They introduced a time of use rate for 300,000 customers who had advanced meters. They have 1 million, but 300,000 had the advanced meters. But that rate was very mild between peak and off-peak. The peak was only 30% higher. Some customers shifted half their load because the messaging was so strong, shift your load, save money. And one customer was quoted in the Seattle Times as saying, I shifted half my load, and it turns out I saved $1 a month. I just wish they had told me that this will be not worth my time and effort. So you can also mislead customers with good advertising. It was not good advertising, honestly speaking, was it good in the sense that it was so strong, the pitch, that California had the energy crisis. The state of Washington doesn't want to have an energy crisis, so please shift to time of use rate and save money. Well, it was very disappointing. I was involved in that at the tail end. There was nothing that could be done. The program had to be shut down because there was a revolt, and 10% of the customers just left the rate. They had a new CEO, he just shut it down. My fear is this investor-owned scenario might play out the same way, and I have been talking to them, but for better or for worse, they're not listening to me, and the commission is more than happy. So this may turn out to be a success story. I hope it does, but it may not. Okay, so let's keep on going. Next slide. Okay, then let's go over to Colorado. Holy Cross Energy Cooperative serves 50,000 customers, the areas around Aspen. They offer a peak time payback program, which is simply a peak time rebate like the one in Maryland. And their program offers a pretty generous credit of $1 for each kilowatt hour reduced compared to their baseline usage. And if it's not a critical event, but a mid-level or high event, then it's half the price. Their rate is, I believe, around 12 cents or something in that neighborhood. So they are very proud of it. I have not seen the results, but this is a program that some utilities regard as a no-lose program for customers, and it's certainly a no-lose program, but you have to find a way to pay the rebate. And so it's kind of like a DSM program where you have to fund it through some energy efficiency bucket or some other bucket where you can get paid for the rebates. Now, in the state of Maryland, the way they fund the peak time rebate is they're part of a PJM, which is the biggest interconnection in the US. It's like ERCOT, it's like a wholesale market that's organized. And PJM has a capacity market, which of course ERCOT doesn't. And what PJM does is has a capacity price is $1.25 per kilowatt hour. They just give that to the utility, and the utility passes that on to the customer. So it's self-financing. Next, please. Fort Collins, also in Colorado, they have a time of use rate. I think the peak period price is not hugely higher than the off-peak price. The summer on-peak hour has actually, I stand corrected, the peak to off-peak ratio is 3.6, which is quite significant, and the winter on-peak is 3.1. So this is mandatory for all customers. I have been in touch with them, and they tell me that there have been no complaints. Customers have figured out how to move things around, and they're quite happy with it. So Fort Collins appears to be a very successful case study of time of use with a modest fixed charge. Smart is a successful story of time of use with a pretty significant fixed charge. So we have two municipalities very successful. Next slide, let me see what we have there. So I don't have a slide here, but let me just orally mention it. The Salt River Project is also a municipality with about 1 million customers in Arizona. They have about 30% of their customers on opt-in time of use, also very successful. And on the J.D. Power scale, they are one of the highest ranked utilities in terms of customer satisfaction. APS, Arizona Public Service, actually has almost, well, they have 62% of their customers on either a time of use rate or a demand charge combined with the time of use rate. So these I regard as success stories. Then there are certainly many, many non-successful stories. I mentioned one of them to you, which was the Puget Sound. There are many others which have a time of use rate, but no customers on it. I regard those as just pretending to have a time of use rate without really having it. So I think I will stop at this point, and let's see if there are any questions that people have. Happy to address those.
I think we've gotten to most of the questions in the chat. I will just chime in on the APS comments you just made about how many customers are on demand charges and time of use. They were successful in rolling out their demand charge rates, in part because they had been testing it for like 30 years.
Yes.
So to setting customer expectations and understanding what's going to happen to customer bills, they had a lot of data to go on. And then to Dr. Faruqi's point earlier about marketing and communications and messaging around it, I believe APS is the one that had the marketing phrase, don't tower your power, level your load, which is really sort of a vibrant visualization of demand happens when you tower your power. So don't do that. Level your load and you put less demands on the system. And that would sort of help people understand what a demand charge was. And I mean, you say it like that, it's really easy to understand that the more things I do instantaneously, the bigger the impact I'm going to have on the local system.
Exactly, and they have YouTube videos. Many utilities are now using those videos to convey the messaging. And one last quick comment I'll make in terms of the messaging element. A lot of our customers don't know where their bill is going. So if it's $120 a month, a lot of people think it's the lighting load, but the lighting load is typically no more than 10 to 15% of the typical house load, and it's even lower if you have LEDs. So then they think maybe it is my TV usage. Well, it is not your TV usage. It is not the usage for charging your electronic equipment. That is really small. The big use is air conditioning for most utilities, followed by refrigeration, followed by clothes drying. So the challenge for utilities now is how do I tell my customer where their energy dollar is going? So more and more utilities are investing in what is now being called load disaggregation. So it breaks up your usage using the data from your smart meter. They have analytical AI kinds of algorithms that can decompose it and tell you, you know, your big use is you have 5 refrigerators and they're using a lot of power and they're very old. Or you have an air conditioner that's very old, or your set point on the thermostat is 69 degrees and you might want to consider moving it to 70 degrees, or put in a smart Nest or Ecobee thermostat so that when you're not home, it can make those adjustments. So again, these are issues we can dive into perhaps later on. Why don't I stop here and turn it back to the chair?
Well, thank you. We've still got a couple of questions that are on the chat. We have a little bit of time, Dr. Fergie, if you could just
Sure.
looking. There's just 2 more questions, if you don't mind.
Well, absolutely, I'm more than happy to. So I guess let me look at the one at the very bottom.
Well, Al's got one on natural gas appliances. And then Mimi's got, a question on different co-ops and owners. You can read them.
Yeah, okay, got you, right. So let me begin with the one at the very bottom from Dr. Femi. Kindly speak to how IOU, MOU co-op ownership plays into the success or otherwise of rate structure changes. Great question and a sensitive question as well, right, given how the industry is organized. I have found that utilities that are municipals or co-ops usually have a better relationship with their customers. They don't have the PUC regulating them. They don't have what I would call adversarial hearings in which everything is torn apart. There is a more cooperative atmosphere in those conversations. I'll give you another example. Omaha Public Power District, I was working for them as a consultant a few years ago. They wanted to raise their fixed charge by a factor of 3 in 5 years. I said, boy, that's going to be really tough because people are not going to be happy with that. They said, well, let's try it out. They had outreach customer meetings. They convinced the customers that a higher fixed charge didn't mean a higher bill. It actually meant a lower energy charge, which meant you had more freedom on how you used your energy. And then, sure enough, they put the proposal to the board and the board approved it and nothing happened. In California, they tried to go from a $0 fixed charge to a $3 per month fixed charge, and that was denied. So, that sort of the ownership structure, the regulatory structure definitely plays a role. But what also plays a role, honestly, is leadership within the utility and leadership on the board. There are some utilities like OG&E that are aligned on why they want to introduce new rates from the top down, and it shows. Everyone up and down the organization is committed to making it a success. I will not name a California utility where the commission said, thou shalt do this, have a default critical peak pricing rate, and the utility didn't want to do it. So I was brought in to help analyze why it was not happening. And I talked to 4 different departments of that utility. It turned out 2 of them wanted to do it, the other 2 didn't want to do it, and the top management didn't want to clarify the situation. So you need alignment up and down the value chain within the utility. That's point number one. Point number two, you need to have a good, successful image with your customers. If they don't like you for whatever reason, doesn't matter if you try to help them, it won't work. So invest in engaging with customers. Okay, let me go up. I know a new question just popped up. I guess it is about CPS. I'll let somebody from CPS answer it. And going up above to the question that's there, trying to understand the question, but that would be demand or kWh in the combination of gas. Maybe it's continuing something that's further up. Oh, okay. With TOU or CPP, would the utility be at advantage with the residential customer having gas heaters, gas dryers, and gas cooktop oven? So if you are an electric only utility, you would be at an advantage if most of the load is non-electric in terms of managing your peak demand. But if you're a combination utility, like Pacific Gas and Electric or like CPS, then it really doesn't help you. You need programs on both sides. And more gas utilities are now actually looking into demand response programs and even modifying their rates. The gas industry is about 10 to 15 years behind the electric industry when it comes to innovation of the kind we are discussing. Okay, then does CPS have a fixed monthly charge? I think it has been answered by Chad. Looks like it's $8.75. And
Okay.
then I think
It looks
Anita,
like-
is Anita referring to her question above? Trying to find that question. Can somebody else spot it faster than me?
Well, I think her question had to do with
Or the
time of
impact
use
on low
rate.
income, the impact on low
Yeah.
income customers?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So yes, that is a very important question, and I ran into it in Australia, as far away as Australia. I most recently run into it in Maryland, and Maryland has a very large percentage of people who are LMI customers. They call them low and moderate income customers. So they have just been running a pilot that concluded, 2-year pilot, where they had 2 channels. One was LMI customers only, the other one was non-LMI customers. And they tested to see, are TOU rates going to help or hurt the LMI customers? And the answer, I can tell you, and I can send you the report, Chad, you can share with the group, was amazing. It showed that the LMI customers understand the rate, they're taking advantage of it, and their bills are going down and not up. Not as much as the non-LMI customers, because the non-LMI customers have bigger usage, but they're still better off with the time of use rate compared to if they didn't have it. So at least in Maryland, that has been tested and shown to be a positive result.
Okay, I think that's all the questions and just about all of our time, Dr. Fakwe. Very good job tonight. Thank you so very much. And we'll see all of you in 2 weeks. Thank you.
So Mr. Chair, I'll just say one thing in closing. I really enjoyed the conversation. I know we couldn't address all of the questions. Happy to find a way to address them at some other point. And I'm really glad my internet didn't, botch up the job. That was my biggest fear, was losing the connection. So I didn't want to mention it because I could jinx it, but so far it looks like it worked.
You held firm. You did a great job. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you. Enjoy the
Good
evening.
night to all.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody.